A history of Immanuel Lutheran Church cannot be done in the absence of some consideration of times in which the church started. The Chicago fire of 1871 had left over 100,000 people homeless. Many of these were among the wealthy of Chicago. They moved up to Evanston on the North Shore because it had a cleaner, more pleasant rural atmosphere and because its building codes or laws of the time did not forbid the construction of large wooden frame mansions such as this one, which were outlawed in Chicago to reduce the fire hazard. Evanston at that time was still rural enough that the town's 2 policemen had among their duties rounding up stray cows. Evanston was much smaller in those days than it is today. It extended from Lake Michigan on the east to about Wesley on the west, and from Foster on the north to Crane on the south. To the north and west lay swampy woodlands. An important factor in the history of Evanston was Northwestern University. This is the original Northwestern building. Immediately south of Evanston lay the village of, logically enough, South Evanston, serving as a buffer zone between Evanston and Chicago and serving as the homes of the working class people who helped to support Evanston: household servants, blacksmiths, carpenters, tinsmiths, bricklayers. Among these people were many of the original members of Immanuel Lutheran Church. They moved to South Evanston rather than Evanston in large measure because the taxes were so much lower. Evanston residents had to pay taxes to support their modern water processing plant, which furnished them with pure drinking water, while South Evanston and Chicago had to rely on inadequate wells or on polluted Lake Michigan water. It was not until 1892 that the South Evanston residents finally voted to merge, so they could take advantage of Evanston's good schools and pure water supplies. This was an era of rapid population growth in Evanston and in Chicago. It was said that the Chicago population had more Swedes and Germans than any but the largest 2 cities in those 2 countries. The Evanston population tripled between 1880 and 1890. In this era, there came to Evanston Miss Josephina Erickson. Around 1886, a group of people started to meet for worship services. On January 10, 1888, under the leadership of Pastor Sven A. Sandahl, 60 people of Scandinavian descent gathered in Union Hall in Evanston to found Immanuel Lutheran Church. Pastor Sandahl Trinity Lutheran Church in Chicago, just north of Diversey. He came here as our first vice pastor to serve our congregation until we could call our own minister and to help us get organized. Trinity Lutheran Church is no longer a Lutheran congregation, but it served us well by furnishing us with a vice pastor during our formative period. This is the original parish register of Immanuel Lutheran Church from the first congregational meeting, January 10, 1888. It's signed by Pastor Sandahl. The little congregation prospered, and by March of 1888, they'd raised sufficient funds to purchase a lot and a church on that lot. The location is presently occupied by the sanctuary and the north end of Fellowship Hall. The original church building was placed where the north end of Fellowship Hall is now. The acquisition of that church building occasioned the first mention of Immanuel Lutheran Church in the Evanston newspaper, March 1888.
The old German Lutheran Church, which was formerly located on the west side of the track, has been removed to a new location on Lake Street near Sherman Avenue, having during the process been naturalized as the Swedish Lutheran Church.
It served Immanuel until 1899 when the present sanctuary was constructed. It was later sold to Trinity Lutheran Church, a Norwegian congregation, and finally to the Knights of Columbus. Few churches have served so many congregations in so many different locations. That the congregation was able to raise the $2,400 necessary to purchase the church and the lot is remarkable, considering that in 1888 a working man might make $1 a day and a servant girl might make $1 a week. Of course, prices were a little lower. A gallon of gasoline sold for 15 cents at that time, but no one was quite sure what to do with it. In the fall, the first pastor, the Reverend August Edgren, arrived to take charge of the work. He's shown here with the 1891 confirmation class. Under the stimulus of the new building and the new pastor, the work progressed until there were 100 communicant members and 40 children in 1889. These were exciting times in Evanston. A steady stream of Swedish immigrants came to the United States and found their way to Evanston and promptly joined our church. There was talk of electric lights to be put in Evanston. Real estate was booming with a steady demand for houses that could be rented for $15 to $20 a month. Straw hats sold for a nickel and up. Unfortunately, in 1893, there was a depression, the like of which would not be seen again until the Great Depression of the 1930s. History records a decline in church interest and in attendance and in financial contributions during those difficult days. Finally, in 1895, with a declining church population, Pastor Edgren resigned. He would not come back to the church again until 1917 as an interim minister. In 1896, Pastor Carl Solomonson became the minister. In 1897, an annual meeting authorized a subscription for building a new congregation as the population of Immanuel Lutheran Church increased. The original blueprints for the church show an imposing structure, a Swedish Lutheran church for Immanuel of Evanston by architect Henry Cole. This is the side of the church facing west. This is inside the sanctuary facing toward what is now the choir loft and the organ location. This is a cross-section of the church. And this is facing the altar. Here's an exterior view of the church shortly after it was finished. Notice that on the bell tower, the decorations, the little stone turrets all around it. To the left of it is the original parsonage, which was later moved up next to Evanston Hospital in order that the present fellowship hall could be constructed. With the church and the parsonage erected, Pastor Solomonson resigned and left. Pastor G.K. Stark came to Immanuel in 1901. A subscription was raised to retire the church indebtedness completely. In 1903, the 15th anniversary was observed. The church choir raised $2,000 to buy the church's first pipe organ to replace the small portable cabinet organ which had served the church previously. The Dorcas Society was organized during the year 1905 under the leadership of Mrs. Anton Stark, who continued to be its leading spirit. This is an interior view of the church showing one of our stained glass windows and the original pipe organ and the location where the choir sat for many years in the front right corner of the sanctuary area. Pastor Stark left in 1907 and student Carl J. Silverston served in the interim. The pastor from 1908 to 1910 was Dr. Ludwig Holmes, a noted poet who raised the money for Evanston Immanuel to have its first large church bell. He died while away on a trip to the east, and the bell was first tolled at his funeral. Miss Irma Nilsson recalls.
And I remember that my folks and Mr. and Mrs. Emil Newman shared one of these carriages that they had at that time, with the driver sitting up ahead and then the horses below. And evidently they stopped at our house to let my mother and dad off after the funeral. I remember the carriage.
From 1911 to 1913, Pastor C.A. Wendell served Immanuel and began the use of the English language in the Sunday school. He later wrote a book on evolution. Reverend Philip Andreen served Immanuel from 1914 to 1917. During this time, the church purchased the property next door, which was used for a girls' home. When he left, Pastor Edgren returned as an interim pastor, awaiting Pastor Victor Pearson's term. Margaret Paulson recalls this time of Pastor Edgren's ministry.
He was a very distinguished-looking gentleman with a white goatee. And as a child, I was fascinated when I saw him up in the pulpit preaching because his goatee wiggled and waggled. And of course, I watched that a lot more than I listened to his sermons.
In 1917, Dr. Victor Pearson came to Immanuel directly from the Augustana Seminary, Rock Island, at the age of 25. It was during the war years, and he served as a chaplain in the Army. The following summer, I attended a Swede school for 4 weeks in the church basement. That was my foundation for the Swedish language, which I now read and write.
The words of Miss Irma Nilsson. Pastor Pearson is our oldest living ex-minister. He's now 96 and living in Arizona. He sent us a letter of greetings during our centennial year. In 1920, Pastor Pearson left and Pastor Oscar E. Ledane arrived. Mr. Jim Friedner recalls his first experience with Pastor Ledane and Immanuel.
He said, on Friday, we have Luther League, so I want you to come. So then, Friday after supper, I took a walk down to church, and when I came here, there was a gentleman standing outside, and he said, "Are you Friedner?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Pastor Ledane said you were coming, so I thought I'd just come out and greet you." And that man was Francis Karlborg.
During the Roaring '20s, Immanuel grew, and many Swedish immigrants came here, who formed a group called the Aftenringen for fellowship on its Sunday afternoons. They had outings and had a lot of good times. The good times were not to last, however, because on that Black Friday the Great Depression came along. Immanuel suffered as its members suffered. But they persevered and were in 1930 able to redecorate the church by covering the outside with face brick, in the process removing some of the ornamentation which was clear in the original photographs of the church. This view shows the interior of the church as it was as the Immanuel approached its 50th anniversary. As part of the 50th anniversary festivities, the congregation was able to redecorate the interior. At this time also, Pastor Carl Sodergren came to Immanuel, replacing Pastor Ledane. The women's home next to the church was discontinued and it was used as a Sunday school. Here we see a rare treat, the church picnic from 1937. This is the wedding of Art and Olga Strobeck, not long after that, presided over by Pastor Carl Sodergren. (1937) was also the 50th anniversary of the Martha Society, shown here in 1914 at an early meeting. Immanuel's church groups were helped very much by Mrs. Anna Stark, shown here. No history of Immanuel could be complete without a mention of her work, along with that of Josephina Erickson in the early church. Here are the Sunday school teachers in 1936. In 1941, the shadow of war in Europe loomed over the land, but the young fellowship group could still have outings to Camp Augustana.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces.
The words of President Franklin D. Roosevelt set the tone for the early 1940s. This was a going-away party for one of the first boys of Immanuel to go off to fight in World War II. Many of today's church leaders can be recognized in the photo. Pastor Sodergren was succeeded by the Reverend Earl Gustafson in 1942, who served until 1945. Here he's shown with one of the confirmation classes. In 1945, the Reverend John Helmer Olson was called as Immanuel's pastor. In keeping with a post-war boom in church membership and attendance, the Immanuel congregation attained a confirmed membership of 600 by the end. Reverend Lloyd Stivers served as an intern at Immanuel during that time. Here he's shown on the right at the dedication of the Fellowship Hall, which was built by Immanuel. Reverend Stivers recalls some of his experiences at Immanuel during that time, beginning with the pastorate of Professor Olson.
Pastor Olson met me at the train station in Evanston, got me a room at the YMCA, and I was the intern at Immanuel in Evanston for approximately 17 months. It was November 7th, 1954, when I would lead the last worship service in the for the congregation. There are many memorable things that happened. There are some that really stick out in my mind. I can still see that the first Sunday in August of '53, Gus Hermanson came across the back of the church and up the side aisle and bent me in the sacristy. I'd made the announcement earlier in the service that Pastor Olson was feeling better and he was hoping to come home that week. Gus told me he died that morning in the hospital. And I had to go out and tell the congregation that their pastor had just died. Not an easy experience for a young, inexperienced intern. But the months that followed that occasion became for me a very real blessing. To be in a congregation that was in a building program where I essentially could watch it being done, and it was done by the laity and the leadership of the congregation. I certainly didn't have anything to do with it. But in June of 1954, the parish education building was dedicated. Needless to say, it was sort of a mess during some of those days. and trying to think over some of the things that happened, I recall vividly the day that Hedvig Olsen came to me. She and John were the custodians. Hedvig came to me and in her Swedish brogue, in fact she couldn't pronounce the name Lloyd, she called me Stiver. She came and said, "Stiver, the circus day is filthy." With a little bit of investigation, I found out that what she was saying to me was, the sacristy is filthy. But I've never forgotten Hedvig and John. Truly good Christian people.